No, that's fine. I will wait for a few more people to matriculate in. What? Oh, okay. So does my wife. She's not here, so I can say that.
You just have to hope nobody rats you out.
Oh, they will. Somebody will. Do you know what Chuck said?
I'll share on Wednesday, but I promise I will share.
Did he leave me live, or did he?
You're live.
I'm live. Okay.
I'll actually take that off and do it again. It gives a new address on the web. If there's any
Oh, so if everybody signed on, you do that, it frustrates people.
we don't have anybody on.
We don't? Okay.
Bible class usually gets 1 or 2. Worship will get 12, maybe even 5.
18. Wow. That's a lot. Okay. Well, we're continuing on with the Roman Empire to look at the environment, what was around in the first century, and then from the data that we have as far as what the environment was at, then we're looking at parts of the Bible to say, okay, how is that reflected in what we have described in the Bible? So you can understand a little bit more about the Bible if you understand the environment that the first century Christians lived in. That's the whole thought. And most of it comes from New Testament survey. My wife had it. Everybody's had it that I think has been to a Christian college. So it's a pretty good survey book as far as what goes on in that environment. So it helps if I turn this on. There we go. So, still look at society, but we'll close off the society today. We may look at next week going into little things like the currency, the languages, and the different philosophies that surrounded Christians. And that probably will be the more in-depth discussion that we have, is the philosophies that were in the environment they lived in. And there's a couple of them that are talked about, which we'll probably really focus on, that are in the New Testament that they talk about. But we'll get to that probably next week. So, back again, my big orange circle is most of the people were ordinary Jews. In other words, they weren't the leadership, they were the rank and file. And that kind of gets to my last question that I added here. What were the main jobs of the rank and file that the Jew performed? What did they do? Agrarian was big. You look at the parables. What are most of the parables that Christ uses that he talks about? A lot of it's about crops, isn't it? So it reflects that agrarian society that they lived in at that particular time. And they were other ones that did various things as far as what was Christ's father's profession? He was a carpenter, okay. So you had people who built things. You had people that were stonemasons, obviously, when they came back from, certainly if they came from Babylonian captivity, they came back, they had to redo stones and everything like that in order to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. So they had all kinds of crafts and skills. They were different kinds of artisans. Oop. Not fast enough. I'm entitled. Turned 72 last Sunday. I don't move this fast.
Sorry, I'm my sister passed away at 9:30 last night.
So, again, we talked about the major schools of thought. Society was divided by the three things that I had on the other one, which was the rank and file Jew, and then the leadership, and then the slaves that were in the environment. But these are the different philosophies. These are different schools of thought that they had. Doug went through most of the Pharisees and Sadducees last week. I think I have a little bit more. This is one where Luke describes Jesus talking and comparing two people. And this is one of his, quote, I guess you could say parables, where he talks about there's two people that are praying. One's a Pharisee, one's a tax collector. The Pharisee's there and says, boy, I do all these great things for you, God, and I thank God I'm not like that tax collector. And the tax collector says, hey, I'm a sinner. Have mercy on me. Wouldn't even look up. So, who is Jesus talking to in these verses? We know? It kind of precedes this section. The disciples. So, what's the Pharisee lacking that the tax collector had?
Money.
Well, he didn't have, a tax collector is going to have a lot of money.
No, but Pharisee.
Yeah, but what's the Pharisee lacking? Huh?
Trash.
Praise? Humility. He's arrogant. He thinks, you're so lucky to have me. And the tax collector says, I don't know why you're merciful to me, God. It's the stark contrast. And he's trying to teach him to say, watch out for the Pharisees. This is the next one. And the colors do mean something. Jesus said to the crowds and disciples, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are official interpreters of the law of Moses. Okay, they're the official ones. Notice what particular group do they not mention at this particular time? It's kind of devolved into this, but who should be the teachers of law? Who should be the interpreter of the law of Moses?
I would assume the priests.
Which should be the tribe of Levi. It ain't mentioned. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Everything they do is for show. On their arms, they extra wide boxes, prayer boxes, with scriptures inside. And they wear robes with extra long tassels. And they love to sit at the head of the table at banquets and the seats of honor in synagogues. They love to have respectful greetings as they walk into marketplaces and be called rabbi. What sorrow awaits the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, and you Pharisees, hypocrites. But you shut the door of the kingdom and the heaven in people's faces. You won't go in yourselves, and you don't let others enter either. Again, what are they guilty of? Hypocrisy. Who are the teachers of the religious law? The Sadducees. The Sadducees had more or less taken over the temple. They were the scribes and the Pharisees, the scribes and those who were teaching more. The Pharisees were the leadership, but the Sadducees were more those involved in the law. Remember, the teachers of the law of Moses that really stuck to the law of Moses, because the Pharisees didn't. The Pharisees added the Mishnah and they added the Gemara. But the Sadducees says only the Pentateuch. That's what we really have to teach. And so he's talking about both of them. Both of them were hypocrites. Again in Matthew, we have the teachers of the religious law. That would be Sadducees. And the elders, the leadership. Those were mostly the Pharisees. So again, he's talking about those particular ones. This is where, at the particular time, Christ has been arrested in the garden, and he's taken to Caiaphas, the high priest. Teachers of the religious law and the elders had gathered. So all of the leadership, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were gathered there for an illegal trial in the middle of the night that they're not supposed to do. So in that one, I just said, what, 2 groups? What did that scheme reveal about their approach to getting rid of Jesus?
It was neither proper, appropriate, or legal.
Yeah. It wasn't proper. It wasn't appropriate. It wasn't legal. It was deceitful. It was sneaky. Did he ever do anything wrong? No. So it was evil. If he was righteous, they had to be evil. Sally.
Couldn't there be fear among them as to Roman punishment, or because this man, our Lord Jesus, was bringing a new philosophy, and he was stirring up the people, so to speak. And I think one of the biggest fears was, insurrection against the Roman.
I'm repeating this for the people who can't hear it, that may be looking online. But what Sally's saying is, could it be fear that they were trying to keep the people safe by saying, okay, we have an insurrectionist and like that? That was the charge that they brought, that they went to Caesar with, or they went to Pontius Pilate with, was that he was an insurrectionist. But he never, ever said anything to rebel against the Romans. Matter of fact, when they asked him about, okay, who do we pay taxes to, which they thought they had him, he says, well, whose inscription's on the coin? And he says, it's Caesar. He says, render unto Caesar, which is Caesar's, render unto God, which is God. So there was no basis for that particular one. Their whole motivation was power and money. And they wanted to control the power and the money, and they saw him as a threat. And it's kind of interesting because after this trial that went until sometime in the morning, because I think by 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock he was on the cross, the Jews had been saying, well, we can't kill him. It has to be the Romans that do it. But who killed Stephen? The Jews. They stoned him to death. That was a sham. They could have killed him if they wanted to. The Romans wouldn't have done anything. He wasn't a Roman citizen. He had no rights. Not from what we studied here. Jesus had no rights underneath Roman law. They could have killed him. It wouldn't have been a problem. Paul would have been a problem. But Jesus, no problem at all. So all this that they did here was just strictly because of greed. So that's the Pharisees and Sadducees. The other little sliver that was in there that I had talked about was a philosophy, was the Zealots. Jesus called his 12 disciples together and gave them authority to cast out all evil spirits and to heal every kind of disease and illness. Here are the names of the 12 apostles. So he goes through all of them. And the one in green is the one I'm focused on, is Simon the Zealot. What was a zealot? Don't say someone who is zealous. A zealot was somebody who advocated for the overthrow of the Romans. He was the one who looked at the model that they had with the Maccabees, that they overthrew the Seleucid Empire. It's what Hanukkah is all about every year, is they celebrate throwing off the Seleucid Empire control, becoming an independent state. And the Zealots were the same thing, for the active revolt against the Romans, which is what led to, in 70 AD, the Romans finally saying, okay, we're going to stop this. We're going to crush it. And they did. They crushed it. So, also in Acts, when they arrived, they went upstairs to the room in the house, So again, Simon the Zealot is still part of the group. He's still part of the 12 apostles. So how do you think, so the first one was early. It's Matthew 10. Acts 1, it's now gone all the way through. He's seen the crucifixion of Christ. He's seen Christ resurrected. He's up in the upper room with them. How do you think Simon, his view changed after being with Christ through to his resurrection? Do you think it changed? If it did, how do you think it changed? We don't have anything that says what Simon, because Simon didn't write anything that we know of. Nothing was preserved if he wrote anything. So, no. No. What it had to be was Simon may have said, you know what? I had the wrong antagonist, not protagonist. I had the wrong enemy. The enemy is sin. The enemy is the world. And what we need to do is free ourselves from the world. Hopefully that twisted it back around. He said, I'm a zealot, but maybe I'm a zealot for Christ now. I'm a zealot for what he's done to set us free. It doesn't matter what it is in this physical world. I think it has to, because I look at this one here with Matthew. This is very early. And at this particular time, the disciples were with him. You've heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat also. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask. And don't turn away from those who want to borrow. So, how do you think Simon, this early in his discipleship, reacted when Christ spoke to say, if a soldier demands you to carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles?
If that 2 miles leads you to the dump,
I,
if that 2 miles leads you to the dump, I'll carry it.
Okay, if that 2 mile leads you to the dump, I'll carry it. Who's the soldier going to be? It's going to be a Roman. So, you can see how far Simon had to come away from where he was to follow Christ. Last one. This is slaves of the Roman world, not Jewish society, because I'm going to talk about Jewish society, but in the Roman world. Had very few rights. You could go to court, but you probably weren't going to win. And if you were abandoned by your master, you could be freed. If you killed your own slave, considered murder, but the mistreatment would have to be extreme and extraordinary. Raping your own slave, making them a prostitute was considered okay. Acceptable, ordinary. So what restrictions did they have? Did a Roman have? Yeah, you couldn't kill them. So it was quite different, though. The first one that we have in the scriptures that talks about a servant or a slave is Hagar. Who was Hagar? This isn't the cartoon Hagar the Horrible. Who's Hagar?
Sarah's handmaiden.
Sarah's handmaiden. Okay. And what were they trying to do with Hagar? What was Sarah trying to do with Hagar? Yeah, kind of a surrogate mother, trying to satisfy what God had told Abraham, right? So what's her status or social position with Abraham and Sarah? She's a slave. What options did she have with her mistress? She didn't have any. So what shows that, hey, my status has changed? Huh? She had a child, and Sarah had no child. How big a deal was it to have a child for your husband? Huge. And, I'm the satisfaction of the prophecy, not you, Sarah. My child's going to be the one who's called out, which started down a whole different path. Certainly where they hang their hat as far as Islam, as far as that son being the firstborn. So, it talks about it being a servant, but look in Galatians. When Paul's writing the people of Galatia, he's a little bit more specific. Abraham had two sons, one from his slave wife and one from his freeborn wife. The son of the slave wife was born in human attempt to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise. So again, the social position she still had was she was a servant. It talks about in Genesis. Here, Paul makes it a little bit plainer. She was a slave. But there are restrictions on Hebrew slaves. And you can kind of see that all the way through the scriptures. They handled it differently, much differently, in many respects. But there was, we've had some sermons I've heard before in the past where it says, it was really a pretty good life for a Hebrew slave. Some of them may have had it. But there weren't all that many restrictions. But there's some here. So let's see. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he may serve for no more than 6 years. Set him free in the 7th year, and he will owe you nothing for his freedom. Big difference. If he was single when he became your slave, he shall leave single. But if he is married before he became a slave, then his wife must be free with him. If his master gave him a wife while he was a slave, and they had sons or daughters, then only the man will be free in the 7th year. But the wife and the children belong to his master. But the slave may declare, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I don't want to go free. If he does this, his master must present him before God. Then his master must take him to the door or doorpost and publicly pierce his ear with an awl. After that, the slave will serve his master for life. So, what's the major difference between a Hebrew who's a slave versus a Hebrew that's a slave to a Roman? What's the big difference? They were certainly treated better. Yeah. I mean, it was mandatory. It wasn't, and this is for a Jewish slave, because I'm going to talk about a slave that was a slave of a Hebrew that was not Jewish, and it's different. But in this particular one, it's a year of Jubilee. 7th year is the year of Jubilee. So you could have that particular slave for 6 years. What they came into slavery with, they left with. If they garnered more while they were a slave, they couldn't take it with them. Now, might have been some masters that were good to say, okay, take your wife with you. But there were provisions that were very specific on how you treated Hebrews treated Hebrew slaves. So I said this. What's the 7th year referred to? What's the 7th year of service referred to? Jubilee. Year of Jubilee. Redemption? Okay. I think I get to it in the scriptures where they call it the year of Jubilee, but yeah.
I think it's like a 50-year deal. The whole nation does that. Every 50 years, in slavery.
Is that now?
No, I don't think it happens now.
Okay.
I don't know
Okay, well, let's see what the scripture has to say. I'm sure I'll get to it because I only had 19 slides and I'm doing real well today, which is unusual for me. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not satisfy her owner, he must allow her to be bought back again. But he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. But if the slave's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave, but as a daughter. If a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. If he fails in any of these three obligations, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. So what's special conditions for a Hebrew girl who becomes a slave? There's a bunch. And if you remember what I said about Roman law said about a slave, this is a huge difference. What are the three things? He says, any of these three obligations. What are the three obligations? Food, clothing, sexual intimacy. If any of those three, she can leave. How about he has a son? Young girl's there as a slave. Wants to marry her. What does she become? Her daughter. If the owner isn't satisfied, she can be bought back. He doesn't have an option. Now, what's the stipulation as far as selling her if she doesn't satisfy him? Huh? Yeah, you can't sell him to a Roman. You've got to sell him back to the father, the family. You can't just sell her off to make money. So there's special conditions associated with that's provided for in the environment. You know, they're let go after 6 years. You have to. You have to treat them right, everything like that. However, in Exodus, there's three things that they talk about. If a man beats his male or female slave with a club and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. But if the slave recovers within a day or two, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. That's harsh. So there was harshness associated. They didn't treat him great, or they were allowed to not treat him great, but there were provisions. If a man hits a male or female slave in the eye, and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. If a man knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. Why did they pick those two? Why did they pick the eye and the tooth? It could have been that. It could have been you hit him with something and crushed the eye orbit and they couldn't see out of the eye anymore. Excuse me? Yeah. What was it like if you were blind in that environment? You couldn't do anything. Couldn't provide at all for yourself. So if you already took out one eye, you had to be put out of that environment. The person who did that, you had to be separated from, okay? Because you had to be able to survive in that environment. So you can see the eye. What about the tooth? Why is the tooth a big deal? That could lead to all kinds of problems. They didn't have dentists. They didn't have any of that. So if you lost a tooth, it may lead to where you couldn't eat. So that was a big deal. You're going to lose teeth anyhow in that environment. But those were two big things. So if those things happened, the slave had to be released. You didn't have that in the Roman law, but you had it in the Jewish law. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but on the seventh day you must stop working. This gives your ox and your donkey and a chance to rest. It also allows your slaves and the foreigners living among you to be refreshed. So what's that constraint?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Going back to verses 26 and 27.
I think it's for the slave. It's to release the slave from bondage. Okay, you blew it. Now this is for a Jewish slave to a Jew.
Because there's this part
Oh, no, it said, to me it says, must let the slave go free in order to compensate. Because he paid, or she paid, a lot of money for that slave, just for the 6 years. And it's like, your investment's gone.
But that's my point.
Yeah, it's a punishment for the slave owner because he violated the rights of the slave. Mm-hmm. So what other constraints do you have on the last part? Constraints that you have on the Hebrew slave, particularly in 3:12. Everyone, everything that lives and breathes and like that, but it includes the slaves. So I don't know who cooked on the day of the rest, but they didn't serve. Everybody was resting on the day of rest. Everyone was included, including the foreigners. So it was the slaves and the foreigners. Everybody was supposed to be resting, supposed to be not working on the Sabbath. Again in Leviticus, no layman, however, is to eat the holy gift. A sojourner with a priest or a hired man shall not eat of the holy gift. But if a priest buys a slave as his property with his money, that one may eat of it, and those who are born in his house may eat of his food. What's the difference between a layman and the slave of a priest that it indicates here? He could eat the holy gift. Who ate the holy gift and he shouldn't have? David. Okay? He ate showbread. What does this really, did I ask that question? I did not ask. What does this really indicate with respect to the relationship between the slave and the priest? He was property, but he was more than property. He was part of the tribe. He was part of Levite because he'd been bought by the priest. So that's a pretty significant difference. Because the layman, who was a Jew, a free Jew, couldn't do what that slave did. That's pretty significant. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, the Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest aftergrowth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for your food, yourself and your male and your female slaves, and your hired man and your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you. Even your cattle and your animals that are in your land shall have all its crops to eat. What does this say about the crops? What can you do and what can't you do with the crops in that seventh year?
Yourself.
You can partake of it yourself. What can't you do? You can't sell it. You can't harvest your crop and sell it to make money in that seventh year. You can eat it. Everybody who's in the household can eat it. The animals can eat it. But anybody else who wants to come onto your property can eat it. It's for anyone who's hungry. And there's no restriction at all. The only restriction is they can't take any of it and harvest it and sell it either. It's for people to have food. And I'm sure you can gather up some of that food and save it for future years. But it's there for anyone who's hungry. How does that 6 years correlate with what concerns slaves? No, you planted the crops, so it didn't rest. Yeah, but it's just like there's the year of Jubilee after 6 years. There's also this Sabbath rest every 6 years. That seventh year is the completion of a cycle. You know, we talk about the number in numerology in the scriptures, that 7 is completeness. Well, here you see it. It's a complete cycle. It goes 6 years, the seventh year, then you start the 6 years all over again. So the correlation there is also the freedom of the slaves. Okay, whenever that slave came in, so this one is 6 years, then 7. 6 years, it's for everybody. It's a fixed cycle. For the slave, it's the first year they went into captivity, went into being a slave. 6 years later, on the seventh year, they're gone. They're out. They have to be out. So it's staggering because every year somebody's brought into slavery. Every year somebody comes out of slavery because it's their seventh year. But there's that correlation that I could see between the two. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not be subject to him to a slave service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. So this is where it talks about the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and he shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. For they are my servants whom I brought out from the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave sale. You shall not rule over them with severity, but are to revere your God. So this is again in Leviticus. What's the special conditions for a Hebrew who becomes a slave because he's poor?
Treated as a slave.
He's not treated as a slave. A countryman. Yeah. And in the year of Jubilee is that seventh year that it talks about here. He's going to have to be, you have to let him go. So that's where it comes in from earlier that we had, I believe it was, I don't think it was, it may have been Exodus. where it talks about the 6 years and then the seventh year being the year of Jubilee. So it is not to be sold in a slave sale. In other words, you're not to sell them to somebody else. You're certainly not allowed to sell them to a Roman. It has to be within the Jewish community, and he has to stay to be your slave. My last slide. I'm done early. Okay. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of the families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land. They also may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. So how do the conditions for a Hebrew who becomes a slave versus a pagan who becomes a slave differ? Yeah, there's no year of Jubilee. And at the end there, you shall not rule with severity. The Roman law kind of comes into effect for how you work with a foreigner, a pagan. But there isn't a lot of restrictions there. But the Hebrew slaves, there's a lot of different restrictions that you have as far as society. So it's different. There's a lot more provisions in the Jewish society. There's the year of Jubilee that they have to be released. So there is that God recognizes that I'm going to make sure that people respect those people who are sold into slavery that are of my people are taken care of. And after 6 years, they have to be let go. But if you saw what I had at the beginning, the amount of slaves in Jewish society was really small. It was down 1-2% probably. Whereas in Jewish society, it was about 15 to 20%. Much bigger. And you were permanent. You were sold into slavery. You had very, very, very few restrictions. So there's a stark contrast in that part of the society. So you can see between the two different societies that you had, there's going to be a lot of friction because of the philosophy of how they treat each other, for the philosophy of who is a better person than the other one. You can kind of see with that creeping in with the Pharisees and the Sadducees that thought they were so much better people than the Romans. Okay, so you can see that friction between these two societies that continued on and on and on until 70 AD, when finally the Romans said, I've had enough. And you had Vespasian and Titus, his son, that stomped them, destroyed Jerusalem. And the last stand was in Masada, which is kind of a raised up area that they were on. And that's where the Jews and the Zealots took their final stand. As a result, the Zealots, the Essenes, and the Sadducees no longer existed after 70 AD. The Zealots, obviously, because the Romans killed them all. The Essenes were the group that went off and they ended up writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. But they went off and they were no longer a part of the society. And the Sadducees, well, they ran the temple. Well, the temple had been destroyed completely. The only ones that survived after 70 AD and persisted into today, really as a philosophy, are the Pharisees. So that's kind of the society that they lived in, that Christ taught in, and kind of how it evolved towards 70 AD. So you have some of the later books, you can kind of see all that's moving in that particular direction. A lot of them were written in the 60s, 60 AD, a little bit before the destruction of Jerusalem, before everybody that was there that was Christian got out. So we'll pick up, Doug will pick up next week. I think probably where we'll go, I'm thinking right now, Doug, we might go into philosophies and talk about the Gnostics and some of the other ones that we had as far as the other ones that were in there. And we'll pick up with that. Thank you.